Hello, everyone, and welcome back to That Christian Nerd channel. So, in today's video, we're going to be talking with Christian philosopher and theologian Dr. Lionhart to see how we can make sense of Christianity or if Christianity does indeed make sense. I'm really excited to have him on as a guest, but before we get into that, just real quick, note that my next live stream is going to be talking about the difference between biblical counseling and Christian counseling, which one we should use and that sort of thing with a Christian psychologist, Dr. Scott Shaw, who's a professor here at the university that I attend. So, very excited about that. And some future projects that I've already previously mentioned in different videos, such as the Biblical Slavery series, still working on that, and some other things as well. So, with all that out of the way, let me go ahead and introduce my guest. How you doing today, Dr. Leinart?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I gotta say, your last name is epic. It
Hey,
is
I made it
nice.
myself. Well, but
uh,
actually, my last name was Lyon, and my wife's last name was Hart. And when we got married, we legally combined them.
oh, that's
Yeah.
so cute. I love that. So go ahead and tell us who you are, and go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah. Well, I'm Johnathan Lyonhart. Um, I'm a Christian philosopher and theologian. I'm a professor at the University of Jamestown. I'm also a fellow at the Cambridge Center for the Study of Platonism, which is kind of my background, Platonism and Christianity and how they overlap. And I also love doing podcasts, hence agreeing to come on here because I also have my own podcast, the Spiritually Incorrect Podcast, where we cover all manner of spiritually incorrect things. So,
Yeah, I saw some of the interview with the Satanist actually that you and Dr. Seth Hart, who I interviewed in the past about evolutionary creationism, and that was really interesting.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, if we'll have a Satanist on, then we'll have someone on to talk about evolution and creation. It's just whatever,
yeah.
whatever we find fun, we'll do. So,
It is fun. So you guys can also check out this website here that you can go to see more from this from Dr. Lionheart. But I'm curious because one of the things that you mentioned is that you founded a institute for faith and neurodiversity after struggling with learning disabilities. So I guess talk to us about real quick before we get into the main subject matter. Talk to us a little bit about some of your struggles there.
yeah, so my struggle is twofold. First of all, I have ADHD, which everyone seems to be frustratingly self-diagnosing from an internet quiz these days. But like medical could barely get through school, was sent to special programs away to be studied with wires on my head.
Oh,
ADHD.
wow.
And I also have dysgraphia, which is the lesser known cousin of dyslexia. Whereas dyslexia has trouble taking information in and seeing it correctly and reading it. Dysgraphia is the opposite. I have trouble putting information out. And so when I try to write, my hand literally forgets how to form the letters. Um,
Mm.
and so growing up, uh, I got a I got a D minus in English because I couldn't write over and over. I was failing
Yeah.
English, which is hilarious now because I just want to send my English teachers a copy of my book and be like, "Ha!"
Yeah.
um, so yeah, it was learning was quite difficult for me. The combination of having a struggle like dysgraphia with an ADHD diagnosis that made it almost impossible to focus enough to overcome that struggle meant that I almost didn't pass high school. Had to have tutors through the whole process to get through it, and it was. There were times when I think my mom was just relieved that I graduated, and I didn't really learn how to learn until I was at a Bible college where I kind of had the space to sort of slowly figure things out and I guess relearn how to learn in a way that actually made sense to me. Because elementary and high school, you're very much at the whims of your teacher. But in undergrad and graduate, you finally get a chance to kind of teach yourself. There's enough space to be autodidactic, as the term is. And that was when I kind of learned how to learn and kind of figured out how to succeed within this system in a way that made sense to me. And yeah, so that was kind of a very long, exhausting journey to now being a professor myself and trying to help other people to learn, even though like I have no idea how to learn it. And
Yeah.
I barely graduated high school.
Yeah.
Then my kids were both diagnosed with autism, and so we've been struggling with that. And my wife is not diagnosed with autism or learning disabilities, though she'll conveniently enlist things like ADHD when it allows her to get away with certain behaviors. Um, and so we were approaching both dealing with my neurodiversity and the neurodiversity of our children. And we were dealing with it from an insider perspective as someone who struggles with those things themselves with me, but also from an outsider perspective because she's always been good at school. She doesn't have that she's kind of from the outside. And so that tension was kind of what led to the founding of the Numinous Institute for Faith and Neurodiversity, is learning how to equip the church and Christian academics and all of these things to better facilitate neurodiversity, to meet people where they are from both angles, because we want to help those who are neurodiverse, but there's also people like my wife who love people who are neurodiverse and want to know how they can help them. And so we kind of want to meet both of those sides of things. Though to be honest, in some ways, it's more my wife's baby than mine.
Mm.
The Numinous Institute for Faith and Neurodiversity. It's going to be more her thing that she's championing. She's doing her PhD right now, starting right now as well. So I think
Mm.
it's something she's going to take off and really push forward. And I'm just more here's a neurodiverse guy.
Yeah.
We got one, so we can talk about this stuff because anyways. Yeah.
No, that is really cool though. I mentioned to you before the live went on, but I've been trying to advocate for an understanding of psychology and mental health amongst Christians, particularly in the area of like religious trauma, but in general. And so, because there's a lot of misinformation, a lot of people, again, not to attack you, but it's just ideas out there. A lot of people think, demons are causing these mental health issues and that those sorts of things. So, yeah, I really appreciate that, and I think it's really cool to your journey there. That said, though, you mentioned that you wrote a book. So I had the pleasure of reading some of the book. I couldn't get through the whole thing because class and busyness. But the book Monotheism is out there. You guys can check out on Amazon, but it's basically these two people at this bar, essentially this like pub, begin talking about faith and things like that. And one of the characters makes this interesting point, and this seems to be sort of the argument that you have in the book, is that I want to contend that the problem at the heart of the Trinity is the same problem that plagues discussions of how the universe began. The origins of the universe might make zero sense, but somehow or other it must have happened, or else we wouldn't be here talking about it, or else we wouldn't exist at all. And if there really are parallels, then one cannot deny the Trinity for being irrational any more than one can deny their own existence. So that's a really interesting claim, really powerful claim. But help us kind of explore what the problem is and how this argument works from your view.
Yeah, basically, growing up, started attending church, and you started hearing about this Trinity thing, that God is Father, God is Son, and God is the Spirit. But there's not three gods. There's three of them, but there's only one God, and they're not parts of God. They're not different facets or aspects of this one thing. No, each one is their own person, full entity, and yet there's only one true entity, and it's very confusing. And the more I thought about it, the more it just never made sense to me. And I read a decent number of books about it from leading theologians and philosophers, and I always just felt like no one had a real answer to it. It didn't make sense. And so, there was part of me that just wanted to say, well, if it doesn't make sense, I'm not going to believe in it.
Mm.
But then, I started to study cosmology in some of my further studies. My doctorate was on the relationship between space and time and omnipresence in theology, and how kind of like Newtonian and Einsteinian space and time relate to God's presence. And so I was thinking a lot about cosmology in my later studies, and it's particularly this question of how did the universe begin? what caused the universe, what caused the cause, and those types of questions. And the more that I thought about that, the more I realized, well, that doesn't seem to make sense either. People say they have the answer to that, but if you probe just a little bit deeper, it's like nobody has any clue how the universe got to be here. Well, God did it, but who did God? Who made God? Well, the Big Bang caused the universe, but what caused the Big Bang? And it's just there's always these other questions that they're just sort of leaving unanswered when they're talking about how the universe began. And I never have heard a satisfactory answer to that question. And so, I thought, well, it doesn't make sense. But I couldn't do the same thing with that I could do with the Trinity, because if, the universe beginning doesn't make sense, I can't just say, well, it doesn't exist. We don't exist. The universe,
Yeah.
I can't just not believe in that. And so I was in this sort of quandary. And then the more I started to study it, the more I realized, hey, the conceptual philosophical problems that I'm uncovering at the origins of the universe, they actually seem to be very similar to the conceptual issues that I was finding when I looked at the Trinity. The same sort of problems, the same sort of philosophical conceptual issues seem to reoccur in the Trinity as did with the origins of the universe. And the more I looked at it, the more I realized these aren't two problems. This is one problem articulated in two different grammars, the one of
Mm.
cosmology and the other of theology. And so they're not two different things that I can't make sense of. They're actually the same conceptual issue that I can't get past for both. And if the Trinity is the same issue philosophically as the origins of the universe, does it then become as rational to believe in the Trinity as it is to believe in our own existence? Can I deny the Trinity for not making sense any more than I can deny my own existence for not making sense? And so that kind of thought was the background to the book. And I can get into exactly how they are the same issue, because that's the key question, right? Is like, okay, you're saying the origins of the universe and the Trinity they have the same problem in both of them. Okay, but what's the problem?
Yeah, that's what I was gonna ask. So yeah, go ahead and talk to us about what that issue even is.
Okay, well, this is going to take 5 to 10, maybe 15 minutes. So buckle up.
Go go for it. I am here for it.
Oh, get the throat. Haven't done this in a bit.
Yeah.
So with the Trinity, it's, how can God be three and one? How can there be this eternal, timeless Father who's so transcendent in the Old Testament that you can't see him without dying, right? And yet he shows up on earth, incarnate in flesh, as a baby who suckles and whines and poops and learns how to talk, and who even dies. This God who's, the Father up there and the Son down here, and somehow the Holy Spirit, who's not quite physical the way Jesus is, but not totally distant the way the Father is, who, is like wind. You can feel the wind, but you can't grasp it, right? How are all three of these things actually one God? That's the problem of the Trinity, right? Now, let's look at the origins of the universe. Where does all of this come from? Where does the universe come from? And when I say that, what I mean is the universe of becoming. Down here in time and space, I define this universe as becoming, the realm where things become, where things begin and end and become other things. Buildings are built and they become towers, and then empires take over and destroy it and start it again. This is the realm of becoming, where things become other things, where time ravages all things. You know what I'm saying, right? And the basic question is, how did this realm of becoming that I exist in become? How did it start? And there's three kind of options for that. The first option is that becoming kind of explains itself. Well, what caused Johnathan? Well, Bunny Lion, my mother, yes, her name is Bunny Lion. She created me. Well, who created Bunny Lion? Well, her parents. Who created Bunny Lion's parents? Well, her parents' parents. Who created that? Their parents, 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 parents. And it keeps going back till you get to the origins of the species, then to the origins of the planet, then to the origins of the elements that shape the planet, then to the origins of the stars, then to the origins of the universe itself. And then it's like, okay, well, what caused the universe? The Big Bang. Well, what caused the Big Bang? Well, maybe there was a Big Bang before the Big Bang, and it's another universe before our universe. Well, what caused that universe? And it keeps going back. And you keep using things that are in becoming to try to explain becoming, right? One finite temporal thing in the realm of becoming explains another finite temporal thing in the realm of becoming. One thing within time explains another thing within time, explains another thing. And what you end up with there is an infinite regression, an infinite causal regress of causes. One thing causes another thing, causes another thing, causes another thing. If becoming explains itself, it does so infinitely with no first eternal thing, right? And so you end up with an infinite regression. But that doesn't make sense. As, oh, there's some dude behind you. Hello.
Yeah. Yeah. He's a friend of mine. He was doing homework. But yeah,
Okay,
go
it's
ahead.
not like he was listening and was like, okay, this is exhausting, and left.
Oh, no, no. No.
um, so that leads to an infinite causal regress. And the problem with that is I don't think infinity makes sense. And you've probably heard classic arguments about this. If infinity had to happen before we got to this moment in time, would we ever get to this moment in time? Say I said I
Right.
would offer you a cheeseburger after infinity occurred. Would you ever get your cheeseburger?
Yeah.
You never would, because infinity has to occur first. And infinite doesn't just mean a really large amount of time. No, that would just, 20 trillion billion isn't infinite. It's just a large finite amount. An infinite is something that's so large that no matter how much you add to it, you're never going to reach it. It's qualitatively different. So if infinity has to occur before this moment in time, we're never going to reach this moment in time.
Right.
So if the past extends infinitely back and back and back with becoming, explaining, becoming this cause this cause this cause this cause that cause that cause that, then we'd never get to this moment in time, because infinity would have had to have occurred before today in August 2024. And there's other issues with infinity. When you start talking about infinity, mathematicians will often talk about greater or lesser infinites. Um, and I think that might allow them to keep their equations consistent, but I think it, to some extent, well, let me re-explain it in a better way. Say that two cars are circling a block for an
Okay.
infinite period of time, and one is going 20 miles an hour and the other is going 40 miles an hour, right?
Okay.
Now, if they've been doing that for infinity, how many times will have each of them circled the block? They will have each circled the block an infinite amount of times.
Right.
And yet, one of them will have circled the block twice as many times as the other, because one's going 40 miles per hour and the other's going 20 miles per hour. And so you end up having to say that the parts of infinity are equal to the whole of infinity, that half of infinity is still infinity, and 2 times infinity is still infinity. And so some people said, well, maybe there's greater or lesser infinites.
Hmm.
And I'm not going to go that deep into it, but
Yeah.
I just don't think it works. I think you can bracket it out within mathematics and kind of work around it, but I don't think you could actually make sense of it. And so I would say an infinite regression where becoming explains becoming doesn't make sense. It's not a plausible, coherent answer to how the universe got here.
Hmm.
Now, it's realizing that many theologians and philosophers have turned to the second option for how we explain the existence of the universe. Well, if becoming can't explain becoming infinitely, then we have to hit some first thing that isn't in the realm of becoming, that doesn't begin or end, that isn't within the realm of time, something that is timeless, atemporal, something that is eternal, something that never began to exist but exists outside of time, and so just always is, looking down on time, sort of like a chessboard. And you see here the roots of the traditional cosmological argument. So yeah, that's kind of the argument there, is if becoming can't explain becoming, we need some first thing. And what I've called this in my book is being. Being itself, not becoming something that becomes something else within time,
Hmm.
but something that is sheer being, that simply is eternally. It never began to exist, for it exists outside of time. It's timeless. Only that which begins to exist needs a cause of its existence. But if something is outside of time, it never began to exist. It just always is.
It wouldn't make sense to talk about beginning of that of a thing of the existence of a thing that's outside of time, because beginning suggests a point in time, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you try to explain the universe using an infinite regression of becoming, that doesn't make sense. And so a lot of people pivot to, well, there has to be some timeless first cause that's outside of time that stops the regress. Infinite, it doesn't, the universes don't go infinitely back. There's a first thing. And that first thing doesn't itself need a cause because it's eternal, it's timeless, it's outside of time. So it never began to exist. So it doesn't need to be brought into existence. And
Hmm.
so a lot of people have said, well, that's God. God is the one thing that's outside of time. And then somebody else will say, but who caused God? And they'll say, but nothing caused God because God is outside of time. God is timeless.
Right.
And then they'll say, well, why couldn't the universe just be timeless? Well, because freaking look around you. It's not outside of time. We're in time,
Right.
right? Like I'm doing this because I'm inside of time. If I was outside of time,
Yeah.
I'd just be frozen like a statue because there's no beginning or ending or movement or cause and effect. There's just an eternal now.
Yeah. Right.
Oh, now, that's the second option, being. What explains our universe of becoming? Well, being does. A timeless, eternal, atemporal being that's outside of time and so doesn't need to begin to exist, for it's always existed eternally, timelessly. Um, but and this is where I don't agree with the cosmological argument, I don't think that makes sense either. Because,
Really?
because how could a timeless being begin to create the universe? As soon as you say that a timeless being is timeless, okay, you get out of who caused it, but then you negate its ability to cause anything else either. Because if it's outside of time, it can't begin to create the universe because that's a time label. You can't begin to do something unless time already exists. Now, some people say, well, God's eternally creating the universe. Okay, well, if the cause is eternally enacted, then the effect will be eternal as well. In which case, the universe is eternal as well. But again, we're obviously not timeless, we're in time. And so, how does this timeless entity begin to create the universe of time? And honestly, I've never heard a good explanation for that. I've heard a lot of theologians stumble around it. And if we're just being honest, like, let's just be honest, guys, nobody has a great answer. How do time and that which is timeless merge? Well, I don't know if they can. That's about as clear a contradiction as you get. That which is within time and that which is not time. You're like, it's either timeless or it's not, or it's in time. Like, you can't have both of those things meet without some sort of contradiction coming at the point where they do meet.
Okay.
And so my belief is that, okay, we wanted to get around the infinite regress of becoming. And so we appealed to being. But by appealing to being, we made God impotent to begin to create anything. Because if you remove him from time, he can't begin to create the universe of time. And so the only way you can avoid the infinite regression is by making God unable to create anything at all.
Mm.
And as soon as you were to try to wiggle in a little bit of, well, but maybe God could begin to do this, then you're back to the infinite regression of becoming. Because how did God begin to do that? And what caused him to begin to do? Like, then you've just reasserted the problem in a different language. So those are the first two options: becoming or being. What created the universe? Well, an infinite regression of becoming. Oh, but that doesn't make sense. Oh, okay, but the infinite regression isn't actually infinite. It has a first thing that starts it off, that flicks the dominoes going. That's being. Oh, but no, how can a timeless being begin to create in time? How can time and timelessness meet at a point? Well, that doesn't make sense either. And so the second option of being also doesn't make sense for how we got the universe. And so, well, let's go to the third option: both. Yeah, it's alliteration. I used to be a preacher. So the options are becoming, being, or both. Now, both is essentially saying, well, what if whatever created the universe is somehow both being and becoming together? In which case, it would eternally, timelessly exist, but it could begin to create the universe in time. It would be transcendent, eternal, beyond time, and yet it could act in time in temporal, timely ways. Okay, that could explain how we got here, but that also doesn't make sense, because how can it be both timeless and temporal at the same time? How can it be atemporal and temporal together? How can it be in time and outside of time at the same time? So again, that doesn't make sense. So all three options for how the universe got here, becoming, being, or both, do not make sense. And, I don't want to be arrogant about this, but I've read a lot of cosmology, and I've never heard an account for how the universe got here that didn't fit into one of those three in one way or another. There's a lot of very different, unique, diverse ideas for how the universe got here. There's different mythological origin stories. It came from chaos. It came from God. It was sang into being, all these different accounts. But I think most of them conceptually can kind of slot into one of those three options. Because, we're basically saying the universe was either created by something that was temporal, atemporal, or both. Either A, non-A, or both. That kind of exhausts the options, logically speaking. And so I don't think anyone has ever been able to give a satisfactory explanation for how the universe came to exist. Not just in terms of scientifically, we haven't proven it, but conceptually, it's not even conceivable. There is no way to make sense of how the universe began to exist. Now, I've at least attempted to show that doesn't make sense. And I've tried to say that the Trinity doesn't make sense. Should I go to how those are the same issue, or do you want to pause
Yeah.
that question?
Well, that's kind of what I was thinking about. Is like, okay, well, these two things don't make sense, but like I'm still thinking about them as different issues. Why?
Yeah.
What reason do I have to think about them as the same issue?
Yeah. Well, let's go to it. Basically, the problem of the Trinity is you have this sort of eternal father figure who's transcendent, who's infinite, who's absolute, who, like I said, Moses can't even see him without dying in the Old Testament. He's very transcendent, eternal. That aspect is emphasized. And yet the insane thing about the New Testament is that this dude shows up claiming to be his son in time, incarnate. So there's this sort of timeless, transcendent entity that's also somehow one with this incarnate, temporal, flesh-dwelling dude who exists within time and space. And then you have this spirit thing that is sort of like the third member in this weird date. Awkward, and that people are trying to articulate what exactly is the spirit in all of this. And the spirit kind of, we've often talked about the unity of the spirit, but the spirit's kind of like this in between. The spirit is like the Father in that it's invisible, it's transcendent. You can't grab the spirit, and yet the spirit, like wind, has impacts in the world of time and space. Wind can pick up buildings and smash them and stuff. And so there's this weird sense in which the Trinity is straddling three entities who I think quite nicely parallel the relationship between being, becoming, and both. Because you're basically saying, yes, there's this eternal, timeless being that somehow also needs to be temporal becoming in order to begin to explain the universe. Well, what do we first hear about Jesus in the Gospel of John? Through him, all things were made.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you often think about the Father as the source of everything, as sort of the eternal, like the one that we usually think of as God,
Right.
And yet, through Jesus, all things were made, which is interesting because being is needed to stop the infinite regression of becoming. But without becoming, being can't begin to create anything. It's only through becoming that all things were made. And becoming, being might be stuck outside of time, but becoming can enter into time because becoming can become things. It's temporal.
Right.
And so you begin to parallel the Father to the eternal category of being, and the sun to the temporal category of becoming. And they begin to actually work far nicer than I ever thought they would, and in a way that I usually would be quite suspicious of, because I'm suspicious of attempts to just impose frameworks onto scripture and fit it into that.
Right.
But when you really look at it, how can give me a second? I've been talking so much that I've like looped myself into confusion.
You're okay.
Yeah. Um, the question of the origins of the universe is how can um, something like the both option be plausible, where what caused the universe is eternal, but can also begin to create the universe in time. And I think
Mhm.
that's very much the problem of the Trinity. How do you have one entity who's also one with this other entity, and one is outside of time and one is inside of time? One's incarnate and one's up in the heavens, and they're also just sort of the same entity. And I think that's the contradiction of both in cosmology. It doesn't make sense. How can something be both being and becoming? Well, logically, I don't know how it could be both. They wouldn't wouldn't they have to be parts of a higher synthesis of the two? Well, no, because it's a contradiction. They're one. Um, in a way that we also talk about the Trinity. It's not like the Father and the Son are parts of one God. It's like the Father and Son are both 100% God. It's both of them together. Um, anyway, sorry, I'm kind of flustering myself
No,
here.
you're okay. So
Um,
would the basic argument be that the same problem that we have with the origins of the universe is the same problem we have in the Trinity, in that which relates to the incarnation, in that how does being become, essentially, and how does becoming work with being? And you're saying that the Trinity could in some way give us a map, if that's the right term, to think about how that relationship works, where we have the Father who is sort of being itself, and then the Son who is becoming, and then the Spirit who's maybe a middle ground between the uh, atemporal and temporal realm.
yes, you
That
do a
that's
fantastic
basically the
job. You
argument.
do better than I did. Well,
Okay.
okay, you've helped me kind of get a breather. Let me go back
Mhm.
to the origins of the universe. We showed that it doesn't make sense for becoming to explain itself in an infinite regression. We've shown that being doesn't make sense to create a universe of becoming, because how can it begin to create? And we've shown that the both category, where something that's an eternal being that can also begin to create and becoming, something that's both being and becoming at the same time, well, that doesn't make sense either, because that's a contradiction. Because in order for it to be 100% being, but also 100% becoming, it would have to be a contradiction. It would have to be inside of time and outside of time. And it wouldn't be 50% being and 50% becoming, because that wouldn't be a contradiction. That would just be a mixture. And then you would just say, well, part of it's timeless and the other part's in time, but you still haven't explained how they relate to each other. So, how does one create the world of time? That would just be another infinite. It would just combine the problems of the being category with the problems of the becoming category. That wouldn't
Okay.
solve anything. It would just combine two problems. The only way the third option of both could actually explain how we got here is if what caused the universe is 100% being and 100% becoming at the same time in the same way. The entity that is eternal and timeless can begin to create in time. And of course, that doesn't make sense. That's almost the very definition of a contradiction. Now, if those are our only three options, none of the options make sense. And yet, we one of them must nonetheless be true, or else we wouldn't exist to talk about it.
Mhm.
Because empirically, we do exist. Somehow the universe got started. So one of these three options, something that is beyond our understanding, occurred. Now, I don't know which three of those options are the correct ones. I think atheism would probably go with becoming. A lot of classical theists would go with being. I think my approach would go with the both approach. But you can't dismiss any of those three options simply because they don't make sense, because none of the options make sense. So you can't decide which one is correct, based upon whether they're internally coherent, because none of your options are coherent. I liken this to, when I'm on a committee at my university, we have a certain quota of students that we have to let in, right?
Hmm.
And so you let in all the top students based on GPA, like anyone with 3.9, 8, 7, like they're getting in. But then when you get to the bottom of the pile, it's like, okay, guys, we have one spot left to meet our quota. Okay, well, who has the highest GPA? Well, this dude has 2.7. Oh, he's not in. Oh, but what we have two other candidates. What do they have? Well, they all have 2.7. They all
Mm.
have 2.7? Okay, well, none of them are good in terms of GPA. And so GPA can no longer be the determining factor for who gets in. You got to make the decision based on something else. Extracurricular activities, sizable donations, attractiveness. You so you can't decide based on their GPA because all of them equally suck in that regard. And it's the same thing with the origins of the universe. You can't decide what created the universe based on which theory makes most sense. You got to find some other criteria because none of them make sense. Now, with that in mind, let's then say, okay, therefore, the both option, where there's something that's 100% eternal being, but also 100% eternal temporal time, is as plausible as any other option. Now, let's look at what that option would entail. It might not make sense, but it makes as much sense as our existence. So let's run with it because it's suddenly become weirdly plausible as anything else. In order for the both option to be what it is, it has to be 100% being, timeless being, 100% temporal becoming, and yet not just them separately, but 100% both at the same time. 3 and 1, 1 and 3. You have this entity that is eternal, transcendent, absolute, timeless, that is eternal being, and yet can begin to create in time, that is also becoming, that because it's becoming could perhaps even manifest down here amongst us, dwelling amongst us as one of us, Emmanuel, entering time. It may be one with the Father who is eternal, who no one has ever seen, but through him, through becoming, he has made him known.
Mm.
Being and becoming are one. Becoming was with being in the beginning, and becoming contradictorily was being. Through becoming, all things were made. Without becoming, nothing was made that has been made. I mean, once you
So,
start to pair those things together, it's like, ah!
so
Uh,
you essentially want to say that the Trinity makes the most sense out of the origins of the universe, and thus Christianity then would make sense, or at least would be as plausible of an explanation as the other options on offer.
I think that's the key there, is as plausible as any other. It's
Okay.
not that the Trinity makes sense of the origins of the universe, it's that the Trinity makes as little sense as the origins of the universe, and in precisely
Mm.
the same way. And so, yeah, I don't know how to make sense of how this timeless God is also down here giving hugs, healing people in time and space, incarnate in flesh, and can physically die like any other temporal being. I don't know how to make sense of that relationship, how the dude up there is also one with the dude down here, and yet they're not, they're still separate, but also one. I don't know how to make sense of that. It doesn't make sense. But I also
Mhm.
can't make sense of how timeless being can begin to create the world of time. I can't make sense of how time and eternity overlap. And
Yeah.
either they're one or they're separate. And if they're separate, how do they meet? How does timelessness create time if they don't overlap in some place? And if they do overlap, isn't that a contradiction? Okay, well, so is it time and eternity? Well, they need to overlap in a sense, so they have to be the same thing, at least in one place. So are they two things or are they one thing? And if they're both 100% true, then they're not just 100% one and 100% the other, they're 100% both. So you have something that's 100% being, 100% becoming, and 100% both. And you can make all, and so it's very similar to saying God is, the Father is 100% God, the Son is 100% God, the Spirit is 100% God, and yet There's not three gods, and they're not three parts of God, which is the beauty of what a contradiction allows, because mixtures can be logical. Here's 50% of this, 50% of that. Um, I was out of the office 50% of the time, and I was in the office 50% of the time. That's not a contradiction, right? What is a contradiction is to say, I am in my office 100% of the time, and I am out of my office 100% of the time.
Mhm.
And so if it's a contradiction, it's 100% both things. And so
Yeah.
you can't say it's 50% one, 50% the other, part one, part the other. No, it's fully both. In the same way that it's not, the God is not part son, part spirit, part father. They're fully God. They're not
Yeah.
parts of God. Um, and so, yeah, that's what saying the both option parallels the Trinity allows you to say is, hey, the Trinity doesn't make sense, but it makes as much sense as our own existence, and it's as plausible as any of the other options. And it actually articulates the problem of the existence of anything quite well. So maybe there's quite a lot of wisdom in this. And so just because I've struggled to make sense of how God can be a three in one doesn't mean he can't be any more than the universe can't exist.
Gotcha. So real quick, we do have a question here. So a common analogy used is a developer coding, a person transcending the digital world yet able to act on it. Why can't God be the same, or am I misunderstanding?
Yeah, so I guess the person who is acting upon it is still in time. The coder is in time, just as the code is in time.
Right.
And so there's not this qualitative gap between
Mm,
timelessness and time. It's a temporal coder working on a temporal code. This would parallel the infinite regression of becoming, because the coder in the analogy also has a creator, mama coder, data coder, whoever
yeah.
created the coder, and then that goes back. Well, who? So I think that's a bigger. I think they're qualitatively distinct in that sense.
Gotcha.
But I would also say that I actually think the problem I've just described of the Trinity is a problem that occurs in all analogies. How can self interact with other? Because as soon as self has connected or interacted with other, there's some overlap between self and other, such that the self and the other are like they're overlapping, such that I can communicate to the other. And so, wait, is it self or is it other? Well, it's both. But how does that work?
Hmm.
And so I actually think this enigma of the Trinity and the origins of the universe is actually kind of true of everything. And it comes out in a lot of enigmas around motion, uh, about like, I mean, it come look at subject object dualism. How can Descartes know the external world exists and isn't just a projection of himself? Well, the soon as you're trying to talk about subject and object, there's no way to have those overlap without kind of contradiction or reducing one to the other.
Mm,
And so I actually think the problem of the Trinity is inherent in everything, even in the coded language, because how does the coder interact with their code without just reducing it to themselves? That was a
yeah.
point that I think maybe a few philosophers might get, but which probably wasn't practical to anyone else. So I apologize.
No, you're okay. So you want to say the analogy, as kind of all analogies, sort of break down there because, of course, the coda is in time, but we're talking about someone outside of time, and so it becomes a sort of a bigger issue there,
Yeah, you're doing this
right?
way better than I am. I should be saying it.
Yeah,
You should be following me around,
I'm trying to
explaining.
summarize. So that was good. I'm pretty sure I understand. You want to say that these two issues here, the Trinity and the origins of the universe, kind of have the same issues involved. So also we can't reject the Trinity or the origins of the universe just for not making sense. Which is I think a good maybe apologetic move there. But
And it's sorry, go ahead.
but so um, even though they are the same problem, the Trinity can still map on to the origins of the universe and this language that we're using of being becoming in both in a very interesting way, using the three persons and using even the language of John chapter 1, where somehow the Father through the Son begins to create, and yet they both are eternal from the beginning.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to
Great.
explain it, and I
Okay.
think this is a connection that should have been. I mean, I know I made it really complicated and overly complicated, but it's a connection we always should have made. For Christians have always believed that the Trinitarian God created the universe. We've never believed that these were separate questions. It
Mm,
The question of how creation got here has always been the Trinity. And
gotcha.
so the enigma of how time and eternity relate to themselves in birthing the universe, it should have always been the same enigma of how does this temporal, how does this eternal, timeless, transcendent God somehow begin to create? And
Yeah.
how does he incarnate? And how is it through him that all things were made? I think these things, I don't feel, I used to feel like I was a philosopher imposing my system on things, but I've turned it around to actually Christians should have always been seeing cosmology in a Trinitarian gaze, because the
Mm.
Trinity created the cosmos. Like that's
Yeah, they're
that's step
related to each
one of
other.
the story. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I was just saying, yeah, they have to be related to each other in that way. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so to go back for a minute, we had mentioned that this is the argument and this problem is what's being explored by one of the characters in your book. Now, the other character, Idi, I believe I'm saying that right, has 13 woes or sort of problems with Christianity and religion, and we do not have the time to get into them all. However, I guess since we kind of started talking about psychology and how we're sort of advocating for this mental health understanding and stuff, I thought it would be interesting then to turn our attention to one of the objections that Idi makes, or one of the woes that he's trying to understand. So, to make that transition, here's sort of his statement here. Sigmund Freud showed that God is just a projection of us. So, Daddy didn't love us, so we invented a bearded man in the clouds to give us all the affection that we need. We took human attributes, magnified them in our heads, and then subconsciously projected them into the clouds. Everything man is in small measure, God is in big measure. Humans know some things, God knows everything. Man likes power, God is all powerful. We just take what's human in finite measure and multiply that and then get an infinite God. God is just a projection of us. And I certainly have heard something like this, especially when you're doing like cultural background studies on the Bible. It's really interesting to see like how society and God sort of related to each other. Now I explain this with a lot of like divine accommodation, these other things, but point is like they often bring God along in support for their societal practice, or their societal practice maybe looks like what's going on in heaven. There's sort of a connection between what's above and what's below, all these sorts of things. And so I've heard this idea before, and in the for the sake of ending on sort of a psychological note here about Christianity, what do you have to say sort of in response to that?
Yeah. I would say that, and I'm trying to go slower here because I got way too excited. Um,
Go for
I
it.
would
You're good.
say in the 1800s, early 1900s, as you said, there was this critique occurring in philosophy, psychology, the wider academic disciplines, that humans have just projected ourselves onto the clouds and seen God up there. And we've seen the face of essentially a bearded white guy because, hey, I'm a bearded white guy, so I'm going to project myself onto the clouds. And you know what? It's a really hard critique to answer. The interesting thing, though, is in the mid 20th century, that critique suddenly gets turned on absolutely freaking everything. And even earlier in the 20th century. I mean, you could even go back to Kant. Do time and space exist? Or do humans just think in temporal and spatial categories and project that onto reality? Does
Mm,
mathematics exist? Is math a thing that's true of the universe, or is that just a very rational system that we humans impose upon chaos to try to make sense of it? And now, obviously, today we assume mathematics is true of the universe because we live post Newton. But pre Newton, pre Pythagoras, go back a few thousand years, the idea that human thinking, because that's what mathematics is, it's a very abstract system of numbers, like that
Right.
we just sort of thought of in our head. The idea that that would map onto the universe such that using math, we'd be able to calculate the location of like stars and the trajectory of comets and stuff, that's insane.
Mm.
It's how do we know math is true and not just a projection of our own head? It's almost too insane to believe that the universe capitulates, surrenders to the categories of the mathematical mind of human beings. And a lot of mathematicians and philosophers of science will tell you uh, science can show you what works, but we can't show you what's real because there's no way to know if the human species is projecting or discovering, if we're inventing or discovering.
Mm.
Um, Now, science gets you beyond the biases, perhaps, of the individual human mind, but it doesn't get you beyond the biases of the species as a whole. Because yes, one person, one scientist can make a claim, and then a scientist in Taiwan or Switzerland can be like, no, that guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Here's all the data, right?
Yeah.
And so you can get past the biases of one mind. But if the whole human species is biased because of the very fabric of human cognition, because of the way our brain works, we're just not going to see what's really there. I mean, we don't see in sonar, we're not bats. There's a whole world that's just, like it,
Yeah.
there could be whole dimensions going on that infinitely complicate reality in ways that basically show that everything we've said about everything is just total crap.
Mm.
There's no way to prove that the human species as a whole is discovering rather than inventing. Um, so, and then you see this with the postmodern turn. Thomas Kuhn shows that in the sciences, it's not actually facts that change theories. It's that we look at the facts in a new way. And so it's actually that humans are starting to see the world differently that leads to changes in science, not the evidence itself. That was Kuhn's big claim, which means that it's not that scientific facts change and lead to new theories. It's that science is basically dependent on how you interpret it, which makes it much more subjective. And so Kuhn creates this sort of postmodern turn where the critique that God is a projection turns back upon every other discipline. How do you
Mm.
know that what you're talking about? How do you know that truth is real? How do you know? I mean, how do you know that heteronormativity, certain gender, sex questions, all of it? Like, how do you know that the way that just seems obvious to you is not just a projection of you, your culture, your specific time and background? And so suddenly, everything that everyone thinks is real is now up for grabs, which is interesting because I bet
Mm.
a lot of it isn't real. But once you start to say that things are projections, that never ends. Um, and I mean, do I really know my wife, or have I just projected myself onto her? Like,
Well, hopefully you know your wife.
I mean, I hope I do, but there's people who get to the end of marriage, someone divorces them after 20 years, and they go, I never really knew them. I saw what I wanted to see. I created an idea of them in my mind and ignored the stuff that didn't fit that ideal. And I
there
think,
w-
go ahead.
there was a video I saw in relation to that. He was from a philosopher, and he kind of like philosophizes this like breakup, intense breakup he went through, and he kind of parallels it to science. And yeah, there's one of the things he said is like now you get a new set of facts, which in the scientific realm, is this, and this sort of facts. But in the dating realm, it's, oh, that's why you kept coming home later and later, or that sort of thing. And so it kind of breaks down your sort of original
Yeah.
theory. So it is interesting though that you even make that parallel as well.
Well,
So oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I guess the question is there a way to solve this, for a religious person, or are we just to sort of have this blind trust, essentially? I guess that sort of can be one of the last questions we get to.
I don't think I solve it in the sense of I can prove what's true and what isn't, but I think I do attempt to say that it's plausible to believe you have the truth, or it makes as much sense to believe you have the truth as it makes for the universe to exist. So I do
Go
attempt
back
to,
to that, yeah.
I basically that's the equation of the book. All of these things that we can't make sense of, yeah, you can't make sense of it, but it all makes as little sense as your own existence. And so it's still plausible to believe you might actually know what's true, even if you can't make sense of how that's possible. And now, I think as soon as I'm going to unveil how I think this relates to it in a second. But before I do, I keep talking about contradictions, and everyone's probably going like, he believes in contradictions. I don't necessarily believe in contradictions. Rather, I believe that the Trinity cannot be dismissed for simply currently appearing like a contradiction. So I'm not
Gotcha.
saying the Trinity is a contradiction and the origins of the universe are a contradiction. Rather, I'm saying to my finite mind, they currently appear that way. And maybe when I get to heaven, God will explain it and I'll go, of course, the boy, that's how it makes sense. But currently, it seems like a contradiction. And what I'm saying is, well, if the origins of the universe and the Trinity both seem like a contradiction, and in the same way, for the same reason, then just because they seem like a contradiction doesn't mean you should dismiss them any more than you should dismiss your own existence.
Mhm.
Things don't make sense. That doesn't mean they're real. Until a few thousand years ago, we didn't know how to make sense of the rain cycle. But how did we know it was real? Well, we got wet. And
Right.
I don't entirely know how to make sense of the Trinity, but I experience the Trinity on, I don't want to say a daily basis, but it's active in my life. And
Yeah.
I think I don't know how to make sense of the universe and its existence, but hey, I'm here. Deal with it.
Right.
So, with that said, and my basic belief is I'm a very rational person. I'm a philosopher. I want things to make sense, and it's
Yeah.
precisely that's made me so frustrated with the Trinity and the origins of the universe because it freaking doesn't, and I
Yeah.
want it to. I think things should make sense, but I think reason oversteps when it makes more sense than reality itself. There
Mm.
are some people who are so rational that it's like, okay, that's a perfectly coherent system, but it's not at all the universe we're living in.
Mm.
I mean, that might be someone like Spinoza, like totally coherent, but maybe that exists in a different realm as this perfect, coherent, logical realm, but it's not our freaking realm. Our freaking realm's Alice in Wonderland down here. Like, there's quantum things happening, people.
Yeah.
We got to be rational, but being rational doesn't mean being more rational than reality itself. Reality is what tethers reason from going insane and spiraling off in calculations that no longer have anything to do with reality. That's
Mm.
all said to preface what I'm actually about to say, which is an answer to your actual question. See, I just spiraled in the way that I had said I could avoid. But
Yeah.
basically, how can we know something that is other from us without reducing it to our own categories? And this comes back to subject and object, self and other. How can self know other without reducing other to the categories of the self? How can subject access object, the external world, and ever know that it's truly external from itself and not just a projection of my own mind? Um, and I think bringing it back to the Trinity, how can God transcend my temporal, finite, spatial categories, and yet I still articulate his existence using finite, temporal, spatial language? How can God be spoken of using finite language in time and yet not just be reduced to that? And I think in some ways that's the beauty of the relationship of father and son. I don't think I could talk about the Father. I don't think he can be known. And yet somehow contradictorily in the incarnation, the Son has made him known without
Mm.
reducing him to finitude and temporality. for their relationship at least appears contradictorily such that in this one place, time and eternity meet. And so us beings of time can glimpse at this thing in time and through it see eternity. I don't know if that's true for anything else. And I think this might go towards the exclusivity of Jesus's claim. It's not that God's a dick and doesn't want anyone else to get in who doesn't believe in Jesus. It's that the only place where time and eternity overlap is in the relationship of father and son. The only place where finite temporal beings can meet eternity and transcendence without it just being reducible to our finite ways of thinking is in the incarnation, when the eternal became flesh and entered time. And so, and I think this is key to why Jesus is logos, is word, is reason. He is that which we can actually speak and talk about and reach out and touch and hold and stick our finger in the nail holes. And yet, he's not just reducible to a temporal finite projection of human reason, because he's one with something that's utterly beyond time. And that weird relationship, that only occurs there. So it is because I believe in Jesus that I believe I can speak, that words, the word, logos, can describe in time that which is beyond time. I think thought, whenever it is true and not just projective, is incarnation in some way.
Gotcha. So going back to the original question here before we have to wrap up, the claim being that God and religion is really just a projection of ourselves, you want to say that well, that same objection is can be really applied to pretty much any academic discipline, and even such things as the distinction between self and other subject and object. And you want to go back to the Trinity and our relationship with the Trinity in order to provide a sort of account of why this is probably more than just a projection.
I don't know if I
Does
could
that
say
make
it's
sense?
probably more than a projection, because that's getting to, well, which of the three options is correct, being,
Right.
becoming, or both. But I think it's plausible. It's because I think without the type of move I've just made, you look at it and how can self encounter other without reducing it to its categories? I mean, how can a finite mind perceive that which isn't finite? It's like a two-dimensional entity trying to contemplate something in 7 dimensions. It just can't, because it's
Yeah.
not there. And so I would say that without the type of move I've just made, you basically just have to throw up your hands and say, we can't know what's real. Now, once you've made the move I've made, that doesn't mean you know what's real. Rather, it just means it's plausible that someone could know what's real. It's
Yeah.
not inherently ridiculous, or it's not more ridiculous than our own existence. As long as that person is willing to grant that they exist and then pivot from that to, okay, well, that's ridiculous, but yet we do exist. So maybe
Other ridiculous
yeah,
things are,
yeah.
yeah,
And I
and
don't want
it's not
and I don't want to just say
necessarily
one. I don't want to just say one crazy thing exists, therefore all crazy things exist. Because for me, the key here is that these aren't different crazy things. It's the one thing in different language.
mm,
Like that's
yeah,
why when I was talking about thought, it's not a separate thing from the Trinity. It's the triune relationship occurring. When I'm talking about the origins of the universe, it's not, oh, well, that's crazy, therefore the Trinity's crazy too, and that's okay. Rather, no, it's one crazy thing just described in different languages. The Trinitarian God created the cosmos, and it's through his incarnation that we can see eternal, timeless truths as they are. It's not one crazy thing leads to another crazy thing. It's all just one crazy thing in different discipline language. Sorry, go ahead,
gotcha,
I cut you off.
gotcha. No, okay, yeah, but aside from that qualification, would you think that's kind of a fair summary, though?
Oh
of
yeah,
the
yeah, you
of
did
the
great.
issues. Yeah.
I wasn't trying to say you were
Oh
wrong.
yeah,
I think
yeah.
I was trying to slip in something I'd wanted to slip in, and I jumped on that like, oh, I can slip this in here. Yeah,
Yeah.
you're doing a really great job summarizing all of this. Like I said,
Thank you. Yeah,
I'd like you to fall. Could you just wander behind me, sort of announcing what I've actually said in coherent, in a much more practical language? I'll pay you to do it.
Yeah. So I guess to answer the question then before we close out, does Christianity make sense? Because depending on what people are hearing, of course, of the conversation, they might say no, but that's okay, and some people might say, well, it makes just as much sense as our own existence, and maybe something else. And so,
Yeah.
directly, how would you answer that question?
I think ironically, any worldview that makes total sense is probably the best candidate for being a projection. Because if something totally fits into the categories of the human mind, it's probably just the human mind. You haven't encountered something other from yourself that transcends your categories. You've just projected your categories onto the universe and are only seeing that which fits into your head.
Hmm.
And so I would say, in a weird way, the most rational worldview isn't the most rational option. And I don't know how else to put that. I mean, that doesn't quite make sense, but hey, that's what I'm selling here. At the same time, a worldview that doesn't make any sense at all. I mean, that's a worldview that's so transcendent that it never touches down in becoming. It never incarnates. And if it's true in a way that's not true for me. And I could never know
Hmm.
it or relate to it or be held by it. There's nothing in it for me. There's no overlap between that truth and us. If it doesn't overlap with human cognition, human emotion, human categories, then it's not for me. And so I think
So,
truth.
would
Sorry.
you? So would you want to say Christianity is kind of on this middle ground of like making like just enough not sense to make sense?
Yeah, that's really it. And again,
Yeah.
that comes back to the Trinity, because I think God is timeless and transcendent, and yet God is also immanent. And so God is beyond, infinitely beyond my categories, and yet also can be spoken with my finite categories. I mean, I think it was Barth who said that we cannot speak of God, and yet we must. Well,
Mm.
I mean, finite language can't grasp the infinite, and yet somehow in the incarnation, infinity came down in time and space. Being entered becoming. The atemporal became temporal. And so eternal, timeless truth, beauty, and goodness incarnated in a way that I can see it and know it and speak it. So, yeah, I
Gotcha.
think Christianity, it, it makes the amount of sense that it's any more sense, and I would think it was a projection. Any less sense, and I would think it's nonsense. It occupies that sweet spot.
Gotcha. So you say it occupies that sweet spot, and as such, making a objection to the Christian religion on the basis that something does not make sense, might not, at least depending on the objection or whatever, in it of itself, show that Christianity is false or this aspect is false or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it pushes the question back on everyone else. Like, okay, uh, I believe in the insane, ridiculous proposition of both. Which of the three options do you ridiculously, absurdly believe in? Because I think everyone, people often say, you believe in the Trinity, you believe God is three in one, and then he sent his son. Like, yeah, okay, it sounds ridiculous until you realize that all of us have one of those three options, and they're all ridiculous. So, which poison are you going to pick? And I think
Mm,
it shows that the atheist is not any more rational for not believing in the Trinity than the Christian is for believing in the Trinity, because they also implicitly assume one of those three options, and they're
mm,
not going to escape that. They don't have a better explanation for those things.
gotcha. Gotcha. Yeah. So I I hope at least I did a good job at
You did a great
summarizing. I
job.
did read the book, at least from what I could, and I've also heard you guys, talk and stuff like that. I know at least personally, I'm more in the realm of Bible, biblical interpretation, that sort of thing. Um, but and then theology, right, as part of that. So philosophy for me occupies like a weird space where I'm like, I'm interested in it. I think ethical philosophy for me is probably the one I'm most interested in, most understand. Like I'm interested in it, but like also I reach a point where I just can't anymore. And but I like I said, I hope I did a good job summarizing and stuff like that. Um
You did.
is do you
Yeah.
have any other final comments or anything before we want to close out?
No, no, I think that's great. And I mean, I think we all reach that point where we just can't anymore. And it's because philosophers and theologians are still trying to find a better way to dance around these conundrums instead of just admitting them and working with them. And so
Mm.
yeah, I hate most theologians and philosophers because they drive me insane. They hate me too because I'm just annoying. But yeah, so I would almost say I'm right there with you.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's totally understandable. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you joining me for this. Perhaps we could even do, say, a side video and a different video talking about neurodiversity because we had the beginning, of course, but we never dive deep into what exactly a term means or any of those sorts of things. And so we could do something maybe like that in the future. But
Yeah,
uh,
well, I'd love to have my wife on as well if you'd want to interview both of us. She's
yeah.
starting her PhD at Oxford in a month
Oh,
or
wow.
so. So she's smarter than I am, that's for sure. And she's much more qualified to speak about neurodiversity because she's been living with a neurodiverse idiot for the she, she's done her time. So
Yeah, no, that's fair. Well, then, thank you so much for joining me for this. Thank you, everyone, for viewing. I hope, again, you were able to understand it has been helpful and fruitful for you. Go ahead and check out the Spiritually Incorrect podcast. They do interview a lot of people. So, like, whether you want to think about something like God and emotions or creation debates, all the way down to like Satanism or other a bunch of other things, definitely check out their podcast. I'll make sure like a link is in the description after this. Check out his website. Check out the remind me of the name of the institute again. I'm sorry.
the Numinous Institute for Faith and Neurodiversity.
Yep.
Um, and then the book is called Monotheism, an absurdly arrogant attempt to answer all the problems of the last 2,000 years in one night at a pub. Just in case you encounter that subtitle and you go, well, that can't be the book. That's the book.
No,
Um,
it literally is.
it is, yeah. That's on Amazon. It's also, we have an audiobook of it. The actor does all of the different characters in different voices, and I think it's fantastic.
That's
So
good.
if
I
you
like I said, I did read a chunk of it, and it was pretty funny. And yeah, that is a literal
Oh, I didn't
description of
mean
what's
my
going
book's
on.
fantastic. I meant the actor's fantastic, but I'll take that.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I would love to hear like some dramatized audio of what's going on. I need like background sounds of people at the bar and stuff. That'd be
Well,
really funny.
and that's how it was meant to be. I think the audiobook is not a secondary version of it. I think it's the truest version of it because
Mm.
I mean, we just had this really complicated, hard discussion about very crazy speculative things. And even like I was saying them, but I was confusing myself as I said them. And I think the beauty of the dramatic format of two guys sitting in a pub is they're just having a conversation, unpacking these in a practical, relatable way that's like conversational. Like, oh, this might actually be something someone human might say, rather than this crazy philosopher who has Thor's hammer in the back talking about infinite regressions and a regression that caused the cause. So I think the audiobook version, the theatrical cut, you could say, is the purest version you could get of it because it brings out the drama and the real world conversational nature of it. So
No, that's really cool. But yeah, check those things out. Make sure you subscribe to me. You feel me if you haven't. And we'll definitely have some very interesting projects in the future from other scholars as well. I'd be very interested to see what some other professors at the university have been up to this semester. So we'll see what they are doing as well. But yeah, thank you again so much for joining me,
thank you for
everyone.
having me. It was
Yep.
lovely.